Hi, my name is Madison with Stanley & Associates, and this is our series where we talk about famous or infamous personal injury cases. So far, we have done one other video about Stella Liebig and her case against McDonald's, or as most people know it, the hot coffee case. But today's case is a little different, a little darker. Today's case is a real-life horror story, but instead of masked murderers or demons, we have a giant corporation that you believe is poisoning you and your family. And no matter how much you're trying to tell people and scream it to the rooftops, nobody is listening to you, or nobody believes you, or nobody's acknowledging the truth. That would drive anybody crazy. It's very much gaslighting. Very much so. And working in personal injury, we see car crashes, dog bites, slip and falls. We see injuries that we can see and believe. But sometimes you could be suffering greatly and still not be believed. For Wilbur Tennant of Parkersburg, West Virginia, that was definitely the case. And it is his story that would unknowingly reveal the biggest environmental scandal of our time, and quite possibly one of the biggest personal injury lawsuits of all time. Today, we're going to talk about the DuPont Company versus everybody. Today's case is a massive one, and while it does start with one person, it reveals just how many people were affected by this scandal. And not to be dramatic, which I am excellent at doing, it affects you and I. This case is so scandalous that it inspired the 2019 film Dark Waters. I couldn't recommend that movie more. It does an excellent job at revealing the true horror behind this company. But before you go watch this video, let me tell you about the quaint little mom and pop shop called DuPont and the immense harm they caused to hundreds of thousands of people in the Ohio River Valley. So our story begins in the early 1980s in Parkersburg, West Virginia. The before-mentioned Wilbur Tennant, Wilbur's brother Jim, and Jim's wife Della sold 6 acres of the Tennant family's 600-acre land to the DuPont Company. DuPont Incorporated is a large American chemical company that was established in 1802. They have created and own very well-known brands such as Kevlar, but they are famous for developing materials such as Teflon, which we use on our nonstick cookware. And let me tell you right now, that is information by the end of this you'll wish you didn't know. So Jim actually worked for the DuPont Company. He worked in one of their factories called Washington Works. And at the time of selling the land, Jim was suffering from an unknown, undiagnosed ailment. According to the New York Times, Jim and Della were actually reluctant to sell their land, but because they were facing mounting medical bills, they had little options. Eventually, DuPont would use this land to dispose of non-hazardous chemicals from Washington Works. The landfill's name was Dry Run Landfill, which was the name of the creek that flowed through the landfill. The same creek that flowed into the pasture where Wilbur Tennant, his wife Sandy, and their 2 daughters lived and raised their cattle. Not too long after DuPont bought this land, Wilbur started noticing changes on his farm. Strange suds and foam would begin to appear on the creek water. Minnows in the water were dying, as well as other wild animals that lived on Wilbur's land, such as deer. After a while, the cows that the family considered pets were said to have a friendly demeanor, were starting to become aggressive and would charge at people when approached. Things only got progressively worse for Wilbur's livestock, and he began to take home video to show what was going on. In the video, you can see the creek itself. You can also see the foam and the suds that Wilbur was talking about, as well as the dead fish. As the videos continue, they definitely get progressively worse and more disturbing. Living cows were starting to develop stringy tails, malformed hooves, their growth was being stunted, and they would have these bulging red, receded eyes. You could definitely tell that they weren't healthy. And when inevitably cows started dying, Wilbur took it upon himself to figure out what the cause of it was. By dissection. I won't include the footage here, but Wilbur does go on to show the severity of discoloration of the organs, black and green, and he was saying that the texture was unusual. The cows would have black teeth and would have lesions under their tongue and on their bodies. The reason Wilbur did this, he said, quote, "Every veterinarian that I've called in Parkersburg, they will not return my phone calls, or they don't want to get involved. Since they don't want to get involved, I'll have to dissect this thing myself." And at this point, Wilbur has lost 153 cows. Mind you, that cattle is this man's livelihood. Not only is this just gross, inconvenient, sad, this is probably costing him thousands and thousands of dollars. Now, if you're wondering why Wilbur didn't call the authorities or get a lawyer in his hometown, well, according to him, DuPont had practically owned the town by this point, which actually isn't far from the truth. DuPont's factory brought in jobs, consistent income, great insurance benefits. Not only that, but DuPont donated to schools and churches. Because of this, people weren't too keen on speaking up or acknowledging that there was a problem. Fast forward to 1998, and a man named Rob Bilott receives a call from Wilbur. Rob was a partner at TAF, Stettinius, and Hollister, and he exclusively worked for large corporate clients and not private citizens. But Wilbur called and he mentioned the name of Rob's grandmother, which of course caught his attention. Rob's grandmother lived in a northern suburb of Parkersburg and was friends with Wilbur's neighbor, the Grahams. Rob had visited his grandmother one day as a child, and she took him over to the Grahams' farm to ride horses. Well, when the Grahams found out that Wilbur needed some legal help, they remembered little Rob and remembered that he had become a lawyer. So they suggested that Wilbur reach out to him. They obviously didn't know what kind of lawyer he was. In the past, Rob had actually worked with DuPont lawyers on other cases. But as a favor to his grandmother, Rob reluctantly decided to meet with Wilbur, hear him out, and see what was really going on. Wilbur drove from Parkersburg to Cincinnati to meet Rob at his office. He brought in cardboard boxes full of videotapes, photographs, documents, anything he could collect to prove his case. After hours of reviewing all of this information, Rob had decided there was definitely something wrong, and he took on the case. At this time, Rob was only 8 years into his career and only 8 years into working for this law firm. And something tells me that Rob probably would have never expected this case to fall into his lap and change the course of his entire career. Not only was this an awkward and uncomfortable position for Rob to take, but it was probably really overwhelming. DuPont is a massive billion-dollar corporation that still holds its power. But nevertheless, Rob filed a federal lawsuit against DuPont the summer of 1999 in the Southern District of West Virginia. Bernard Riley, a lawyer for DuPont, called up Rob and let him know the EPA and DuPont would be sending out a few veterinarians of their own to go and see what was going on at Wilbur's farm, which doesn't sound suspicious at all. And wouldn't you know it, the report came back and said that DuPont could not be responsible for what was going on with the animals. But the upsetting part is that they placed blame on Wilbur, saying that it was poor husbandry that caused the animals' illnesses. Basically, from the time that DuPont started operations on the Tennant's land to 1999, Wilbur Tennant just forgot how to take care of his animals. That's a cute little coincidence. And during this time, while all of this is going on, the Tennants were basically shunned by the entire town, even having to change churches 4 times. Unfortunately, at first, Rob didn't really have any kind of reassurance to give Wilbur. As the trial was approaching, Rob still couldn't find any explanation as to what was going on with the cattle. Until Rob came across a letter from DuPont to the EPA mentioning a chemical called PFOA, which was not a regulated chemical by the EPA. PFOS, PFOA, or sometimes called C8, and fluorine are all active ingredients in Teflon. Again, this is the ingredient they use in our non-stick cookware. It is also water and oil resistant. And just a side note, this is also a chemical that was used on military-grade weapons. PTFE is another important active ingredient in Teflon, and it was accidentally discovered in 1938, and it was put to use in World War II during the development of an atomic bomb. Making an atomic bomb requires scientists to handle large amount of corrosive and toxic substances. Scientists were provided PTFE-coated gaskets and liners to resist the extreme corrosiveness. Shortly after the war ended, PTFE was rebranded as Teflon and was marketed towards metal parts and machinery. And finally, in the 1960s, Teflon made its way into American households with non-stick cookware. And now we use it for eggs. Finding this out, Rob asked DuPont for all their related documents on PFOA, but they refused. In the fall of 2000, Rob requested a court order to force DuPont to comply. Of course, they tried to push back against this, but ultimately they had to comply. And they complied. Soon after the court ordered DuPont to release all these documents, dozens of boxes showed up to Rob's office. Each box contained thousands of unorganized documents, including private internal correspondence, medical and health reports, as well as confidential studies done by DuPont scientists. In total, there was over 110,000 pages, and these documents spanned back years and years. And Rob would spend the next few months in his office organizing each and every document into chronological order. And this would not be the last time that DuPont would pull a stunt like this. Rob was persistent and ended up finding a lot more incriminating material. He found that in 1951, DuPont started buying PFOA from a company called M3 so that they could make their Teflon. And even though PFOA was considered a non-hazardous material, probably because it was not regulated by the EPA, M3 gave DuPont instructions on how to dispose of it. There was two options to dispose of this chemical, either by incineration or sending it off to a chemical waste facility. This did not stop DuPont from dumping PFOA. By 1990, 7,100 tons of this chemical had been dumped into waterways that also supplied drinking water. But not only just to Parkersburg, Vienna, Little Hawking, and Lübeck waters had been affected too. Over 100,000 people in all. Documents also revealed that DuPont and M3 had been doing secret medical studies on the effects of PFOA for 4 decades. Testing was done on rats, dogs, monkeys, and the results would reveal links to diseases like testicular cancer and even birth defects. And of course, DuPont did not notify the EPA. In fact, upon finding that rat fetuses were having birth defects, DuPont tested the children of pregnant employees in their Teflon division. Of 7 births, 2 babies had birth defects. One of these employees was Sue Bailey, who gave birth to a baby boy named William Bailey III, aka Bucky. Bucky was born with half a nose, 1 nostril, a serrated eyelid, and a keyhole pupil. He would have over 30 surgeries by the time he was 5 years old. After this, DuPont started to remove women from its workforce. Dr. Bruce Carr, the corporate medical director for DuPont, was questioned about these findings and whether or not they were aware of the risk to women who were exposed to PFOA. He answered that there was not a risk to the women, just the fetuses. And he said that with his whole chest.
So you did see there was a substantial risk to the women at the DuPont plant who were exposed to C8, enough to remove them from further exposure, correct?
No. There was no. There was no potential risk to the women. Based upon the 3M study, there was a potential risk to the fetus.
After all of Rob's work and finding that PFOA was in fact in the Washington Works landfill, the creek on the Tennant's farm was tested again for PFOA, and it was found to have an extraordinarily high concentration of PFOA, proving that Wilbur was right all along. In 2001, DuPont settled with the Tennants for an undisclosed amount. Sadly though, Wilbur was diagnosed with cancer and suffered a fatal heart attack at the age of 67 in 2009, and his wife Sandy would die of cancer 2 years later. After vindicating the Tennants, Rob still wasn't satisfied. While Wilbur had had his day in court, thousands of other people were potentially and unknowingly being affected by this chemical. So Rob would spend the following months drafting up a public brief against DuPont. The draft saying, "We have confirmed that the chemical and pollutants released into the environment by DuPont at its dry run landfill and other nearby DuPont-owned facilities may pose an imminent and substantial threat to the health or the environment." Rob demanded immediate action be taken to regulate PFOA and to provide clean water for those who lived near these factories. On March 6, 2001, Rob sent this letter to basically everybody in charge, everybody relevant to environmental protection and to regulatory authorities. DuPont, of course, wanted to get ahead of this and attempted to issue a gag order that would stop Rob from disclosing any of the information or the evidence found in the Tennant's case. However, a federal court denied it, and Rob was able to send over all his findings to the EPA. And I would like to stress that I am not a lawyer, but a gag order? It's not a good look, babe. This newly found information would put a huge spotlight on DuPont, who, for the last 50 years at this point, had been regulating themselves. Under the 1976 Toxic Substance Control Act, that was hard to say, the EPA can only test chemicals if it has been provided evidence that they cause harm. And it would not be in DuPont's best interest if they let the EPA know what exactly they found in all their testing. Rob's next step was to file a class action lawsuit against DuPont on behalf of all of those whose water had been tainted by PFOA. Joseph Kiger, a teacher and resident in Parkersburg, would be the lead plaintiff in this suit. Joseph had actually received a letter months prior from the Lubbock Water District, basically saying that there was PFOA in the water, but it wasn't a health hazard. The letter said, quote, "Although PFOA is unregulated for drinking water purposes, that is, it has no limit established by a regulatory agency, the DuPont Company has established its own drinking water guidelines as 1 part per billion. Which means if you're drinking 1 part per billion, it's unsafe. This would equate to a drop of PFOA in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. This is purely my personal opinion. I don't speak on behalf of anyone when I say this, but I think the DuPont Company was counting on the fact that the residents would just take this letter at face value. I think that they were counting on people to not ask questions or wonder why DuPont was regulating itself, instead of having an outside government agency say, hey, this chemical is safe to drink. And also just the wording of the letter, I mean, I think I'm a pretty smart cookie, but that would confuse anybody. And I do believe, in my opinion, that that's what they were counting on. And for most people, this didn't raise any kind of red flags. However, Joseph and his wife Darlene had both had a history with DuPont and PFOA, which eventually made them start asking some questions. Joseph took these questions all the way up the ladder to the top. He called the West Virginia Department of Natural Resources, the Department of Environmental Protection, a local health department, and then eventually DuPont itself. I was fed the biggest line of bullshit anyone could ever have been fed. This was an exact quote from Joseph. Soon after, he hired Rob to represent him. As it turns out, that letter actually had legal purpose. You see, in the state of West Virginia, 2 years after that letter had been sent out, the statute of limitations would have run out. And if later you had found out that you had any illnesses related to PFOA, DuPont could not be held responsible. Because PFOA was not a regulated chemical, Rob had to prove that it was hazardous, not only for a couple districts that were near the Washington Works factory, but all of the other districts that waterway had touched. 6 in total, including dozens of private wells. During this lawsuit, there was a lot of gained attention as well as a lot of mounting pressure on government agencies. The EPA started investigating toxicity of PFOA on its own, and in 2002, the EPA shared its findings. PFOA could potentially be harmful to human health, not just for those who drink contaminated water, but also for the general public, including people who cook with Teflon pans. The EPA was especially concerned when they found that PFOA was in American blood banks. However, DuPont and M3 had known about this since 1976. In fact, DuPont was testing the blood of its workers and comparing it to blood of people who didn't work for them, and found that there was actually no difference. In other words, there was no clean blood. The only clean blood was archived blood that was found back during the Korean War, before Teflon was manufactured. Today, 99% of Americans have PFOA in their blood. After all this, M3 made the decision to gradually stop producing PFOS and PFOA. In 2004, Rob's persistence and hard work finally paid off when DuPont decided to settle. They agreed to install filtration systems to all 6 of the districts as well as all the private wells. They also agreed to a cash reward of $70 million, as well as provisions for future medical monitoring to be paid by DuPont up to $235 million. The whole sum of the class action lawsuit being $343 million. DuPont was fined $16.5 million for failure to disclose the risks that are associated with PFOA, which, I mean, is something. The amazing part of this story is that instead of splitting the settlement money, which again was $343 million, the affected individuals decided that it should go towards a scientific panel. And they would conduct studies to determine what diseases were linked to PFOA and how much damage it had actually done. Now, these studies would require the help of the public. And of course, at first there was hesitation. These studies also required people to give blood and go through medical procedures and screenings. It could be pretty invasive. However, in exchange for this participation, people would get $400, which helped the process move a little bit faster. And in 2011, 7 years later, the scientists on this panel began to release their findings. They found possible links between PFOA and kidney cancer, testicular cancer, thyroid disease, high cholesterol, preeclampsia, and ulcerative colitis. As a result of the panel's findings, anybody who lives in the Ohio River Valley who suffers from the diseases that are linked to PFOA can sue DuPont for personal injury. And over 3,500 cases were filed by 2017. The story definitely had many other avenues to go down, many other things to explore, so much I had to leave out because there's just so much to this story. Again, I would definitely recommend watching Dark Waters. I would also highly recommend The Devil We Know, the documentary that was made about DuPont and Parkersburg and this whole entire situation. It is very sad to think about the people who are affected. Many people ended up with cancers and high cholesterol or a combination of several of the diseases, and it is completely unfair. And I definitely hold Rob Bilott in high regard because he was somebody who benefited from representing these multi-million-dollar corporations. Instead, he decided to represent an everyday man and several other everyday people for their pain and suffering.
I'm an attorney with the TAF Law Firm in Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky, and I've been working for the last 24 years or so to help raise awareness about the worldwide threat to human health and the environment from man-made PFAS chemicals. And one of the early steps I took in that regard, when I first found out what was happening and learned that this chemical was getting into drinking water in our country, was I tried to put as much of this information I could together in a letter that I compiled back in March of 2001. So 22 years ago. To summarize what was happening, what I had found out, and asking the governmental agencies to take action to address this chemical. And, you know, it's taken a long time, but here we are 22 years later, and we finally have the US EPA formally announcing that they will regulate this particular chemical in drinking water for the first time, an actual enforceable standard. And starting to take action with some of the related chemicals as well. So it's taken a long time, but we're finally getting there. This is something that impacts all of us, and not only us, but our children and our grandchildren. I mean, you have to keep in mind, not only are we exposed, but babies being born are being born pre-polluted with these chemicals. And these are chemicals that can have such widespread effect within not only all of us, but the entire population. So it's a real public health concern, and it's a threat to our collective environment.
So there you have it, the DuPont scandal. I'm not really sure what to call it. It was a whole lot, really. Go ahead and like this video, comment if you have any other suggestions, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.